first time today, I actually mentioned a number, and I'm going to mention it again today because it really drives why I'm passionate about safety, and it's the number 5. And 5 is the number of times I've been notified of a fatality in an organisation that I'm on the board of. So that's 5 different people. I know exactly their names, what happened, when it was, the circumstances. I know how I felt when I was told. I also know that at no point did I think, what did my due diligence obligations look like, or what did the legislation? It just didn't even factor into my mind. 5 is also the age of the very first fatality I was notified about. A young girl who was 5, a bystander fatality. And that's no more serious or less serious than the other 4, but it certainly makes safety very real. And it means I can talk to you today, and I hope to talk to you as a director who faces this on a regular occurrence. And in fact, this week, just on Monday, I chair a very large listed construction company, and I chair the safety committee, and was notified of what we call a Class 1 incident. I don't know if you call it the same thing. And fortunately, the person hasn't died, but incredibly serious. And I get safety. I'm passionate about safety, and yet these things continue to happen. And I know that you, as leaders of your organisations, go through this same issues. So I want to talk to you from that perspective, but also to talk to you because I happen to have gone and done some research in this area, and hopefully share some of that with you. It's all very good to hear from people who have developed a theory or some kind of framework. That's great, but how does it work in practice? So hopefully today I can share a bit of it from both sides. I note the minister's gone, and obviously I'm not a voter, so I've got no bias. Oh, he's there. He's waving. I'm not a voter. Sorry, I can't help. But what I was really refreshed to hear is your attitudes around life is going to go on regardless of what the legislation says. My overwhelming sense of having spent 48 hours here today is that in every conversation someone has mentioned the legislation to me. When's it coming out? It's been delayed. What's it going to say? What's it not going to say? We're waiting. It's irrelevant. If you're waiting, frankly, you've got bigger issues to be concerned about. You need to move forward on what is the best thing for keeping your people safe. Who knows, with politics, it could be delayed another year. Do you really want to be waiting to have that sorted for you to be doing the best by your people? So today, I'm not going to talk about the legislation at all. I'm not going to talk about due diligence. I know from my own experience in boardrooms that when I pull out the due diligence card, as I think of it, I've really reached a low point in trying to influence my fellow directors. I really am talking to someone who doesn't get it, and I have to sort of pull that card out. It's almost like a fear to say, look, let's just get to a base level. This is the minimum we need to be doing. But I'm going to explain today that context is everything, and every board is different, every organisation is different, and understanding that's important. So today I'm going to look at 3 areas. Safety governance frameworks, very briefly working through, and I think every organisation will be at a different point in what I call a maturity pathway, and helping you identify where that might be. Have a look at what safety leadership can look like in the boardroom. The reality is we're very geographically distant. We meet once a month. We're not involved in the day-to-day organisation. We're here to support you as CEOs. So what on earth can safety leadership actually look like? And then just briefly touch on safety disclosures, because ultimately words matter. And if you're doing all of this work internally and you're not reflecting that externally, I think it's a wasted opportunity. Likewise, if you're using your annual reports as a bit of a PR puff piece, but it's not reflected by reality, that's something that you need to have a think about as well. So I'll just talk about how you can get that aligned. So safety governance frameworks, there's 5 stages, I believe, in every organisation that moves through this particular pathway. And I'm just going to start, I'll move straight through to the first one. And this is what I call transactional. And these are the least effective safety governance frameworks. And I think we'll all know of an organisation like this. You may have a board that perhaps thinks this way at the moment. And this is where there's really a minimal emphasis on safety. It's seen as a transaction. It's just something that management is responsible for. An issue will come to the board after it's become a major crisis, after there's a serious incident. The thought of production over safety is certainly the overwhelming culture of that organisation. There is no safety vision, just keep everyone safe, but I don't particularly want to know how you do it. That's the culture. The safety professionals in the organisation may be part-time, you might outsource it. If you do have one, they are seen as responsible for safety, so everything is the responsibility of the safety guy if something goes wrong. Certainly your line leaders haven't taken personal responsibility for safety, and there's no safety disclosures, it's just not disclosed whatsoever. The second stage, which I think there's probably a lot of organisations in New Zealand currently wanting to become, is compliant. And that is where lawyers, and I'm sure it's happening here, it happened in Australia, law firms get into the boardrooms of every single company and scare them about what's going to happen and tell them that they'll all end up in jail if we don't do this, that and the other. And as you heard, I have a law degree, I am technically a lawyer, but it's unhelpful. So it's unhelpful in that it creates from the outset for those people who don't get safety, seeing safety as just a compliance regulatory framework. And in fact, if you develop your safety frameworks based around that, there's a lot of work that you're going to end up doing down the track. So the basis for safety reporting becomes very compliance focused. It's almost the headings follow the due diligence legislation, and the reporting is a bit of a tick and flick to make sure that if something happens, we're all covered. There's often only a focus on lag indicators. There's a generic safety policy in place. Compliance is really the key driver, so there's no focus on behaviours and what is driving the culture within the organisation. There's minimal safety disclosures, so often you'll just see a token reference to the existence of a safety policy. And due diligence at this point is really the main framework. But in my experience and research, it only lasts so long. So I know I have sat on boards that have been very compliant focused, and there comes a point, perhaps after about a year, has been my experience, where the board directors become more confident. They might sit on other boards, so they're seeing how others do it, and they start to want more. So they say, well, that's great, we're complying with the law, but our trends are still, pretty poor, or they've plateaued. What's next? And so what that you're telling me we've done this many toolbox talks? What's it actually mean? And so this is where boards move into this phase of being much more focused on safety. And they want to look beyond the legislation. And there was a reference before that Australia's had a few years. I would say that this is where many Australian companies are aspiring to be, because the world didn't collapse when the legislation came in. All of the fears that directors might have all passed, and life's gone on and nothing's particularly changed. The good organisations haven't skipped a beat. They're still focused in their own way on doing their absolute best. So boards want to see more from management, and that might include the board deciding to put safety in their board charter, so they're very overt about their responsibilities. A vision would certainly be in place for what they want to achieve. Safety targets are set. Lead indicators are tentatively introduced. There's a bit more focus on where the safety professional in the organisation sits. Are they hidden away in HR? Are they 3 layers below the CEO? Do they actually ever have visibility with the board? And safety management systems tend to be disclosed. So the really concrete parts of safety, you can go and look in annual reports and you'll see companies saying exactly what systems they have. The next stage is called proactive, and I think it's one of the most interesting stages because there's a lot of tension in the boardroom. And this is where, in many ways, the board sometimes overtakes management. So during this focus stage, management's working their butts off, frankly, get really driving a step change in safety and the approach to safety governance. And yet they achieve so much, and the board says, yeah, but we're still not at our vision. We're still not there. What else do we need to be doing, and what more can I be doing as a director? And I've experienced it on boards I sit on where I can feel management getting frustrated because the boards are wanting more and more and more, and may not realise that they need to allocate more resources, or management may feel there's an unrealistic expectation around links to remuneration. This is where it all gets, quite in-depth and well beyond compliance at this point. But I think it is an important stage for organisations to go through. And at this point, boards are much more educated about safety leadership, safety governance. They're comfortable in their roles. Conversations around due diligence provisions are not happening at all at this point. They might have a board safety committee in place to really focus on safety. The chairman may make personal commitments to safety in his letters to shareholders. Lead indicators are really refined now. You're starting to look a lot deeper at what's meaningful for our organisations. And public disclosures are much more transparent, so there'll be lead and lag indicators, and there's really trying to get to that point where we're sharing the good, the news and the bad. Then the final stage, which are the most effective organisations, is where safety is completely integrated with the operations of the organisation. So the concept of safe production is understood and accepted by the board. They get it. There's cascading safety committees up and down the organisation, right from the board subcommittee all the way through to the field, and you have representatives up and down feeding information. Safety professionals understand that their role is strategic. It's not just technical, come in and tell us what the lead and lag indicators are. They understand that business excellence is tied to safe outcomes, and everyone gets that, and so they are a crucial part of the leadership team. Line managers understand and embrace their responsibilities, and they don't, no longer is it tolerated that you can delegate safety to the safety guy. And disclosures are really honest and transparent, and they certainly share the good and the bad. So there's some of the safety governance frameworks, but when we now talk about safety leadership, what does that look like? And context in this case is everything, because of those 4 stages, every board I sit on 5 boards, they're all completely different, so they're all at different points. And so that necessitates from me as a director a completely different way of dealing in safety on one board from the next, because it's unrealistic to think that a board that's very compliance focused, where your fellow directors are very much driven by what the due diligence obligations say, to expect that they're going to understand necessarily overnight how we can be aspiring to be an organisation where safety is completely integrated. And so safety leadership ends up looking quite different. Now, in your packs, I think you've been given a brochure that the forum's put together, and it goes through a lot of these. So I'm not going to go through the definitions of some of these safety leadership criteria, but I'd rather focus on what's practical that you could do. Now, some of these will be familiar and they won't come as any surprise, and then there's 2 that are really targeted at the corporate governance framework that boards are working at. And so the first one's around vision. And this is where obviously you need to be able to have a vision for what you're trying to achieve. This is as the CEO, and the boards need to understand we need one and support you in what your vision is. So that vision obviously needs to be understood. It is excellent if you can be providing your boards with examples or evidence, this I'm talking to the CEOs now, of where that vision is actually being lived. And so some of the great examples I get when we're given our safety updates is where work has been stopped by someone, and not only the circumstances of how and why they stopped work, but how we've rewarded them for that, so that we're rewarding the behaviours that we want to see to build that vision. Also, effective companies, the CEOs will present that vision at their AGM, if you're a public company, at your AGMs. So I had a look at 10 years worth of annual reports and AGM presentations, and I won't bore you with the stats on those. But there are organisations where their external focus on safety clearly reflects what they're doing internally. And that's all the way from shareholders' meetings, investor presentations, annual reports, CSR reports, etc. The board needs to be able to support the CEO in understanding that achieving that vision is their role, but the board's role is to support the CEO in that. And understanding and accepting that the current state of performance is never good enough. So you may get your LTIFR, if we're focusing on lag indicators, the best you've ever had it. But I know, because you're in this room, it's not good enough. And it's a matter of trying to educate directors around that too, because not all of them will necessarily understand that. The second criterion is around personal commitment. And again, this is focusing on what your personal, genuine, sincere obligation and commitment to safety is, and we've heard it already today, which is wonderful, and reinforcing that whenever you can to your employees and to your board. Let the board hear what your commitment is, because it's powerful for them to understand it's beyond just the words in the monthly safety report. Chairman's and CEO letters to shareholders in annual reports are really valuable ways of being able to show that personal commitment publicly. Site visits, making them meaningful, interactive, that's a whole other discussion, so I won't go into that in detail today, but I did talk to the safety professionals this morning about ways they can help to make those much more effective. And encouraging, I've also asked the safety professionals to encourage their CEOs and to thank them for getting out in the field often, and when you're out there having genuine conversations. Decision making is very much focused on the board's role in safety, and that is around having a highly effective safety committee structure, as I've already mentioned, right from the field all the way through to the board. Of course, you need policies and procedures, and I have every confidence that organisations generally are on top of those. It's just how lived they might be. And again, focusing on employees feeling they're able to make decisions around safety and making sure that those free and frank conversations, we heard that term before, are happening in the boardroom whenever possible around safety. And that leads to the final one, which is transparency. And that's making sure that you're sharing information. I mean, this forum is just a brilliant example of transparency, that competitors, different industries, people in the same industry are sharing what's working for you and what's not. The frustrations that you might have put in place an initiative you were convinced was going to solve a particular issue, yet it hasn't, and why is that? And being able to share that with other organisations is critical. And acknowledging publicly that this safety journey never ends. So the last area I want to talk about, and I've just touched on it briefly, is why you might choose to disclose what you're doing around safety. Why is it important? And in the research I did, I set out to answer the research question about whether what is reflected publicly actually reflects what's happening internally. And I looked at two extreme examples, an energy company and a financial services company, which both had very extreme approaches to safety. And it certainly does. So I won't go into the details, but you can imagine the energy company is very focused on public disclosures around safety and reflecting what they're trying to achieve and their safety vision. Financial services was right at the beginning of the journey and made no mention of safety, but recognised that it was something important for them to be doing in the future, because words do matter. So against each of those four criteria, I mapped what kind of disclosures are being made. And there's a whole range of different categories, and I don't want to go into those. But in Australia, 76% of companies disclose that they have a vision for safety. And that might look like safety as a company value or zero harm, that sort of thing. Or linking ongoing business excellence to safe outcomes, so that's their vision. Or statements regarding the importance of leadership and culture to achieving the vision. Or, in fact, there was a growing trend about the company's reputation and linking that to the safety vision. So about just over 3/4 of Australian companies. One example was the BHP report of a few years ago, where the chairman, in his letter to shareholders, talked about the safety values of the organisation, the board's charter, and then he kept using the terms relentless focus and unrelenting focus on safety. So just communicating right from the top of what that vision for safety is. Personal commitment, only less than half of Australian companies, and I looked specifically at the letters to shareholders by chairman and or CEOs, sometimes they're combined. Less than half, so I see this as a real opportunity. There seems somewhat of a reluctance to personally make a statement that you are committed to safety, and so hopefully that's an opportunity for you. But those that were making such disclosures would often comment on fatalities that might have happened, talk about some of the successes or challenges around safety in their organisations, again, talk about the role of the board, and make that link between business excellence and safety performance. Decision making, because it's very tangible, is very popular. So it's very easy to report on what processes you have in place, what committees, etc. And so if you're a public company and you're not disclosing, I'd suggest that this is probably one of the first areas that companies choose to disclose, because it's fairly safe. And so this is talking about what safety documents and systems you might have in place, the board's role in safety, any board committees that you might have, role of employees, employee safety committees, and just generally the role of senior executives in decision making. I had a look at Auckland Airport's annual report last year, and they've started to do that. So I don't know if there's anyone here from Auckland Airport, but the board role in safety was referred to, which is excellent. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about in that example. And lastly, transparency was the final criterion that I looked at in disclosures. And this is where there's disclosures of lead or lag indicators, generally lag, links between safety and remuneration, any internal or external awards, or information about legal action that might have been taken, really just being as transparent as possible about what you're doing in safety. And Contact Energy, again, I don't know if there's anyone here from Contact, but I loved your approach last year in your annual report. They did a Q&A with the CEO, and the question was, it seems that your safety performance has not improved. What are you doing? And they've tackled it head on. So that's being as transparent as possible. And I'm not naive enough to think the PR people, and we have great writers who put together these documents, but it matters. It does matter because it reflects a willingness to acknowledge that things aren't going as well as they'd like them to and that they're working on it. So all of this is great in theory, but it's hard. It's hard work. It's going to be a long road for many organisations that are just starting. It takes years. I mentioned to you at the start about 5, and the young girl that was 5 who was killed happened in my first month as a director. And I'm still on that board 7 years later, and it's been a journey for 7 years, moving through and working and improving to ensure that that never happened again. And that organisation has moved through all of those stages, and sometimes it's not linear. You can move forward and back and different incidents happen. But I can only encourage you to work with your boards, particularly at the moment, to understand that legislation is not the answer. Legislation is simply there as a health check. It's the bare minimum that we all need. Of course, we have to comply with the legislation, but it's not going to drive a step change in your safety performance. So thank you very much.